I'm Phil Teitlebaum. I have an interest in the Bible and in history in general and in UU history in particular. I'm going to resume pretty much where I left off last time, which was essentially the fall of the Roman Empire, which occurred in the 400s. The important thing that happened, the next significant thing that happened historically, was the establishment of Charlemagne's rule as the first great. Nice bird. Well, anyway, the significance of this is that with the fall of the Roman Empire, there was practically no centralized civil authority at all in any of Europe. There was no common language, there was no common culture, there was pretty much nothing. And tribes existed, mostly pagan tribes, throughout the next several hundred years. When the Roman Empire fell, it was a Christian country, but it had only extended Christianity so far, and much of Northern Europe had remained pagan. Anyway, Charlemagne proclaimed himself to be the next emperor of the Roman Empire around in the year 768. He attempted to conquer all of Europe, but it was pretty superficial conquering. I mean, this was still a time when there were castles and essentially a feudal type of society. But the thing I wanted to show here was that the only unifying force in Europe was the church. And one of the things Charlemagne did was he extended Christianity to the various places that he conquered. And on this map, both the lighter tan and the darker brown were all areas that eventually became part of what eventually became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And they were at least loosely Christianized by that time. If you look at the map, you won't notice many country names that you recognize because they didn't exist. What became Spain was a Muslim country. Now, if we jump ahead 700 years, it's a long time, but you're beginning to see the beginning of modern nation states. This is the year 1500 in Europe. France was in existence, Hungary was in existence, Portugal was in existence, and some of the other countries were beginning to form in a manner we would know now. And the significance of that was that there was the beginning of decentralization of the church and of the civil empire, the non-religious things, the civil society in Europe. So the next important thing for our history was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This is what St. Peter's Basilica looks like now. We don't know what it looked like in the year 1500, but it was pretty magnificent. Not quite this magnificent, but it was in bad need of repair. And the church, and in particular the Pope, used a technique that had been around for a couple of hundred years to try to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's and the other buildings in the Vatican. And this is the selling of indulgences. This had started in the 1300s, but on a limited basis. By the early 1500s, the printing press had already been in existence for half a century, and it was easy to crank out these certificates of indulgence. And the significance of the indulgence selling of indulgences is that the church would offer people essentially a get out of purgatory free card if they would give cash money to the church. You could either buy your own way out of purgatory, or you could buy the way of a dead relative or friend out of purgatory. You just had to put enough cash in the till. This became very pervasive in the German-speaking states. Martin Luther was a priest from Germany, from one of the German states, living in the Vatican, and he was not pleased. He didn't like the opulence that he saw around him, and he especially didn't like the idea of selling indulgences. He thought that was absurd. He thought the Pope had no authority to do that and no way to make it stick. So anyway, Luther originally wanted to have a major discussion within the church to get rid of selling indulgences, and instead he was excommunicated. He had to go into hiding, but there was a friendly lord in the German state that he lived in who was willing to put him up sort of indefinitely. But anyway, Luther and his friend Philip Melanchthon came up with a list of reforms that eventually became a whole different religion. And perhaps the most important thing that he offered in his new religion was getting rid of the authority of the Pope. He wanted to also get rid of the priesthood. They reduced the role of Mary, Hail Mary, Mother of God. That they didn't. Luther thought that was inappropriate. That was essentially raising Mary to almost a goddess role. They reduced the amount of saints. They didn't get rid of them altogether, but reduced them. The Eucharist. In the Catholic Church, the wafer and the wine are thought to be literally changed into the body and blood of Christ. And the reformers and Luther, starting with Luther, said, this is just symbolic. You can't pretend that this is actually undergoing transubstantiation. Luther got rid of the idea of purgatory. He said it's not biblical. And he also came up with the idea that you don't get into heaven by doing good works. You only get into heaven by divine grace. And perhaps the most standout thing was this idea of the Bible alone as being the only authority, sola scriptura. In the Catholic Church, it had been recognized there were two lines of authority: the written authority of the Holy Scriptures and the human authority of the Pope. The Pope was considered to be God's vicar on earth and therefore God's representative. And the reformers said that's ridiculous. But the Bible, however, does come from God, and therefore that's going to be our final authority. Contemporary of his was John Calvin. Calvin was a little bit younger, but he got into the Reformed movement also, and he came up with a harsher version of the theology that Luther taught. Calvin himself didn't like it being called Calvinism. He just wanted it to be called Reformed Christianity. But the tenets of Calvinism are going to come up again in other places in my talk. First of all, he said that humans are completely depraved. He also came up with this idea of unconditional election. And what this means in practical terms is that God knows before you are born where you are going after you die. Predestination. So the election means that only the elect make the trip up. That's what this election refers to. It doesn't mean voting. Limited atonement means you can't really atone for your sins and have it really mean anything. God's going to send you where he's going to send you, and you don't have much choice about it. Everything is by grace. Perseverance of the saints just means that the people who were considered saints are still saints. Into this mix comes a Spanish physician named Miguel Servido. We know him by his Latinized name. Among other things, he described the circulation of blood through the lungs, but that's not what we know him for. He was also a theologian. He's the first person that we know of who publicly rejected the Trinity. He considered it unbiblical, and he considered it to be a result of teachings from Greek philosophers of 1,500 years before him. He thought that the belief in Trinity promoted the idea of three gods instead of one God. However, he did still consider that Jesus was born of a virgin with God as the Father, so he didn't reject everything. He did not believe that Jesus was immortal, but he did believe that he was the Christ, which in a way is a little bit like the old Jewish belief. So anyway, the way this was summarized, Jesus was the Son of the eternal God, but not the eternal Son of God. And he published. He also wrote letters to Calvin and wanted to meet with him so he could discuss his theology to Calvin. Not a good idea. Calvin left France, where he was born, and was living in the head of Geneva in Switzerland, which was more tolerant of Protestants. Anyway, the city burghers of Geneva, apparently with Calvin's blessing, burned Servetus at the stake for being a heretic. which is interesting because Calvin himself was a heretic from the Catholic Church, so this was a heretic of a heretic. The next group I'm going to mention is the Socinians. People talk about the Socinians as being early Unitarians, and they were. This got started in the 1560s, and they existed into the 1700s. They were named after an Italian theologian, Fausto Sozzini, and we know him by his Latin name, Socinus. He emigrated to Poland, and he started the first Unitarian churches anywhere.
Okay, I have a question. Do you start them in Poland the very first?
Yes,
Okay, so those were the first Unitarian.
first actual Unitarian
Okay.
churches. So the Socinians, Socinus became the leader of the Polish Brethren. The Brethren themselves had broken away from the Calvinist Reformed Church because they didn't like the harshness of that theology. The Brethren were non-Trinitarian, so they didn't call themselves Unitarian, but they were non-Trinitarian. It's sort of a hair-splitting difference. The beliefs of the Socinians were accepted by Unitarian Christians in England and in Transylvania. And eventually the term Socinian came to refer to any religious dissenters. Okay, so what did the Socinians believe? They rejected the pre-existence of Christ, which is the theology that's exposed in John's Gospel, the fourth Gospel, where Christ is supposed to have existed before the universe. The majority accepted the virgin birth and miracles, but they weren't hard and fast about it. They rejected original sin. They believed that nobody lived forever. They rejected the idea of vicarious atonement, the idea that Christ died for everyone's sins, and they didn't fight. Okay, the next churches we're going to mention are the Transylvanian Unitarians. And Transylvania is here in Romania. Transylvania looks like it was the biggest province in Romania. However, the most famous Transylvanian resident was this person, and I'm pretty sure he was a closet Unitarian. He liked to stay up late, didn't go to church, was repelled by crucifixes. So anyway, meanwhile in England, this is England, the Anglican Church was established. Because of all the reform movement going on in mainland Europe, the people of England were ready for their own reform movement. The King of England wasn't that much interested in a reform. He was more interested in getting an annulment of his marriage. He approached the Pope, who refused to grant him an annulment. So in 1534, Henry VIII decided to form his own church with himself as the head of it. And the first thing he did was he granted himself the annulment he wanted. Now, Henry VIII was no theologian, so he asked the Archbishop of Canterbury to provide religious doctrine for his new church. And at first, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between teachings of the Anglican Church and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. Within the Anglican Church, there were pretty violent disputes about which direction the new religion should go. Eventually, over centuries, they became more and more Protestant, but they weren't at first. So they eventually accepted the idea of salvation by grace and not by works. The Catholic Church had always taught you get to heaven by doing good works. And their headquarters was Canterbury Cathedral. There's the Archbishop. Now, there were people in England who wanted real reform, and they were convinced that the Anglican Church wasn't doing it. These people became known as the Puritans, and they were interested in establishing a religion along the lines of Calvinism. Now, Calvinist theology was harsh, but this is what they wanted. They wanted to get rid of the control of the Catholic Church, and now they wanted to get rid of the control of the Anglican Church. So their beliefs essentially lined up with the teachings of Calvin, and especially the idea that people were basically evil and terrible, and that God decided ahead of time who was going to make the trip. So these were their specific beliefs, that humans are inherently evil and had to spend their whole lives trying to overcome their sinful nature. Salvation depends entirely on the grace of God, and sola scriptura. Bible is the only authority. They established something else that has held into our congregations as UUs, this idea of a covenant theology. This was new. They first of all believed there was a covenant between the Puritan communities and God. They called this the covenant of grace. But there was another covenant that we follow ourselves, the social covenant. And they believed that members of each Puritan community had a covenant among themselves. So not only did they look out for each other, they looked on each other. They basically were busybodies, big time. And they didn't tolerate any deviation or disorder at all within their ranks, and there was very little privacy. Now, there was one specific group of dissenters who decided they couldn't tolerate the persecution from the English government, and they wanted to physically leave the country. These were headquartered in Scrooby, England. These separating Puritans decided in 1607 that they were going to physically leave the country and go to the Netherlands, where they felt that there would be much more religious tolerance for their beliefs. This was their pet dog. So anyway, this group of Puritans left for Holland in 1607. They stayed there until 1620, but they weren't happy in Holland. I think they were not well liked by their Dutch neighbors. And they also didn't like the fact that their children were becoming Dutch, and they wanted them to be more English. They were learning to speak the Dutch language, and they were speaking English with the Dutch accent, and so they wanted to get out. So anyway, they decided to go to America, and they first went to England, where there were only 50 of them to begin with who left Holland. They went to Plymouth, England, picked up 50 people who were not from their church, who wanted to get out of England for any number of reasons. And they settled here. This is Plymouth in the Plymouth colony. And this is Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. What's that? Been there? Nice place. Anyway, they settled in 1620. And of course, we know all the story. They did not call themselves pilgrims, by the way. They were dissenters.
They didn't call themselves that. They weren't called that until the late 19th century.
Supposedly their grandchildren started calling them the Pilgrim Fathers, but they didn't call themselves that. They weren't supposed to be there. They were actually supposed to land in Virginia. They didn't really have a formal charter to be any place, as far as I know, but they certainly did not have they did not have the king's permission to be landing in Massachusetts. But they wound up there because their ship was off course and they couldn't change direction. It was already too late in the year in 1620 to do much of else. It was something like November or December by the time they made it. And a lot of them had already died on shipboard from various diseases, and they needed to get off the boat. So anyway, they established their colony in 1620. 10 years later, a much larger group, now I said there were 50 of these dissenting Puritans who originally came to Plymouth, but a group of 1,000 Puritans came to the area that now became Boston, to the area around the Charles River 10 years after that. And these were much better organized. They had all the people they needed to form a successful colony, which the original Pilgrims did not have. But anyway, they settled in the summer of 1630, and they thrived in Boston. They actually thrived more than the people in Plymouth. Now, this whole area is now what I consider to be the Unitarian Holy Land. Plymouth Colony was absorbed into Massachusetts Bay in 1692, I think, 1691 or 1692. The Puritans in Massachusetts, they called it was Massachusetts Bay Colony, had no separation between church and state at all. Holy Scripture was the law of the land, and you would be punished for breaking church doctrine. The first governor of Massachusetts was John Winthrop, and he sort of established this idea of the Protestant work ethic that people talk about. He did grant the right to vote to all church members. Now, whether that included women, I don't know. Anyway, the colony grew and prospered, And people in Massachusetts, many of them became wealthy merchants. Harvard College was established 6 years after they arrived because they needed a source for ministers. They had no way of getting new clergy. Into this mix come the Quakers in the 1650s. They were not terribly welcome in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Quaker beliefs were that you didn't need clergy at all. Each person can experience God individually through Christ. This is that still small voice within people talk about. They believed in what they called the priesthood of all believers. They refused to fight. They opposed slavery. They also did not drink alcohol, which makes me wonder, how did they not get dysentery all the time from, I don't know what they would drink. You certainly wouldn't drink water if you knew what was good for you. And they had minimal organization of their church. Several Puritans tried to proselytize in Boston in the 1660. The Puritans told them to get out 2 or 3 times. The last time they got out, but it was by hanging. Puritans were not very tolerant. And then the next fun thing that happened in the Massachusetts Bay part of things was the witch trials. Now, it's interesting that this intolerance was not in the Plymouth part of the settlement, because the people in Plymouth had to be more tolerant. There were only 50 of the people we call pilgrims, only 50 of them were Puritans. The other 50 were what they called strangers. They were non-Puritans, and they had to live with them. There weren't enough of them that they could kick them out. But that wasn't the case in the Massachusetts Bay part of things, where everybody was a Puritan. Anyway, we all know something about the witch trials. These started not in Boston, but in Salem in Massachusetts, which was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And scholars looking back on what set up the background for this was that people were fighting with each other within the community. They were not very friendly with each other. There was a lot of religious extremism going on. And over the course of a couple of years, not only were 200 people accused, but 20 of them were executed. This was the worst mass hysteria in any of the British colonies. Yeah, there was a man, I think, who was crushed. So they were not all women, but it was assumed that women were much more likely to be witches than men.
Yeah, the one that was crushed was a man.
Was a man, yes. But the women were hanged. So anyway, the Puritan churches were organized on a congregational basis. This didn't refer to their theology, but it refers to their political organization. Each congregation was unto itself, with really no central authority beyond each church. And these are just typical congregational churches in Massachusetts. Okay, we're going to go back to Europe, because things were happening there that would influence our religious beliefs. People in Europe were starting to question religious dogma. One of the first people to do this was a Jewish scholar named Baruch Spinoza, who was active in the mid-1600s. He was Jewish. He wrote pamphlets that were considered heresy by his synagogue, and therefore was excommunicated from his synagogue in Holland at the age of 24. He changed his first name from the Hebrew Baruch to the Latin equivalent Benedict. Anyway, he became noted for his writings on philosophy apart from his religious teachings. He rejected the idea that the Torah was literally given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. He was knowledgeable enough from going to Hebrew school, actually, for his preparation for his bar mitzvah. He recognized the contradictions and inconsistencies among the 5 books of Moses, and he realized that not one person could have written that. It just didn't, the writing styles were different. And also the words used for God were different in different parts of the 5 books of Moses. So he said this was not literally given to him. He didn't believe in miracles. He thought they were either natural events or they were just made up. And he believed the way to find truth was through reason and not faith. By the late 1600s, science and philosophy were flourishing in Europe. In this diagram, everything sort of revolves around Isaac Newton, but there were many other scientists who were very much influenced by Newton's work. So we've got Brahe, Copernicus, Kepler. These people were all astronomers. Galileo wound up in jail or wound up under house arrest by the Catholic Church for saying that the sun didn't revolve around the earth, but instead the earth revolved around the sun. Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes. So Newton was active in the late 1600s. He wrote his law of how gravity works, and he wrote his laws of motion. And Newton was able to explain or predict the orbit of Jupiter around the sun based on his knowledge of gravity and the laws of motion. So he's the one that explained this. And of course, his most famous invention. So by the late 1600s, it was recognized that there were possibly conflicting theology or conflicting beliefs here. Now, on this diagram is interesting, or this picture is interesting. It's supposed to show a compass. It shows religion and science opposed to each other, but still within the same compass. It's not like one is getting rid of the other. It's just two different parts of maybe the same compass. Okay, back to Massachusetts. The Puritan churches were having a hard time of it within one generation of coming to the New World. The Pilgrims, or the Puritans, had come to the Boston area around 1630. By 1660, their membership was falling off. And one of the reasons it was falling off was to join the church, you had to go through an extensive covenanting process. And the sons and the children and grandchildren of the founders didn't want to do this. They didn't want to have all their sins aired out in public. So the churches came up with what they called a halfway covenant, which made it easier to join the churches of their parents. Membership increased again, and this was the beginning of a softening of their theology. The other thing that was a problem, many of the Puritans had become wealthy merchants and they were trading with other countries, and people in other countries did not like the Puritan theology. The people in other countries, especially Catholic countries, knew that the Puritans were very intolerant of other religious beliefs. And so one of the Puritan merchants said, quote, "It makes us stink everywhere," unquote. Also, in the Puritan churches, retailers could be fined for making too much money. Well, that didn't set well. So anyway, some Puritans did go back to England because of with the revolution in England, Oliver Cromwell became the head of the British government and the Puritans were in charge there. So Puritans were no longer being persecuted in England. So with some Puritans returning to England, some Anglicans came to Massachusetts and replaced the Puritans. And this forced the existing Puritans to be more tolerant. They really didn't have any choice. There was a call for a more inclusive church by 1700. Again, membership declined. By the year 1700, the Puritans had very little authority over civil law in Massachusetts. Okay, so what were the philosophical influences on the religious beliefs not just in the colonies, but in Europe too? Isaac Newton was not an atheist or an agnostic. He believed that the order of the universe was proof that God existed. John Locke, the philosopher, an economist, said that people were not born with ideas. They had to learn the ideas from somewhere else. So in other words, you were not born religious. It was thought, the philosophical belief was that religious growth occurred only through reasoning. Then the idea of revivalism, Christian revivalism, was irrational and there was no place for it. And this last point is significant because there were religious revivals already going on. The first one was in 1734 in the American colonies. This became known as the Great Awakening. And as with some conversions now, there was lots of emotion and hysterics, and a lot of the more thinking theologians said this is not right. So anyway, the liberal congregations, liberal religious leaders reacted to this and accepted the idea that people do have free will and it affects salvation. This was known as Arminianism. So in other words, you're not predestined. And liberal theologians, again, encourage the use of reasoning for religious growth. Okay, so what were the Congregational Church's religious beliefs by the late 1700s? We're moving ahead in time here. The liberal theologians argued that Calvinism itself was not biblical. So they therefore gradually rejected the idea of original sin. They rejected predestination, the Trinity, and they rejected the idea that humans were all terribly depraved. They believed people could actually improve. As an aside, all the churches in Massachusetts supported the American Revolution. Okay, the next person of interest to us was John Murray, who in 1774 established the first Universalist church in the United States. He left England in 1770, became an itinerant minister in Massachusetts, and founded his first church in 1774 in Gloucester. So it wasn't the Unitarians who were first here, it was the Universalists. Okay, so what did they believe? Well, they believed in universal salvation. Murray's specific theology was that in Jesus, God became the Son. He believed that the Trinity, he didn't reject the Trinity, he thought that it was three exhibitions of one God. He believed that all people were united in Christ, and he believed that Christ's salvation, the salvation of all humanity, was through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. In other words, Christ did die for everyone's sins, and that's everyone's sins. So Christian Universalism was sort of based on a passage from 1 Timothy in the New Testament. For therefore we both labor and suffer reproach because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior of all men, specifically of those that believe. Okay, the next person of interest to us is Joseph Priestley. He was a scientist living in England in the late 1700s, active in the late 1700s. Scientists know him as being one of the people who discovered oxygen. There were a couple of others at the same time. Theologically, he helped to establish Unitarianism in England, established a church there with some other people. What got him into trouble there was the French Revolution started up right after the American Revolution was finished. And he supported the French Revolution. Well, this did not go over well with the British government. The English Channel is not that far. There's not that big of a distance between France and England. And the British government was afraid that the French Revolution would extend across the Channel. Anyway, a mob burned his house down. So he thought it might be a good idea to move to the new United States, which he did in 1796. Turns out he was also a friend of, who was he a friend with? The guy who founded Pennsylvania.
Penn?
No, actually it wasn't William Penn. Oh, Benjamin Franklin. He was a personal friend of Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin suggested that instead of going to Massachusetts, that he should immigrate to Philadelphia, which he did. So he established the first Unitarian church in America, in the United States, in 1796. Priestley's theology was that science informed his beliefs. He combined his idea of theism, which is that God exists and intervenes with people, with his idea of materialism, that only physical matter exists. He did not believe in free will. This is interesting, but this is a common belief among thinkers at that time who believed in natural laws and that everything had to have a cause. So he believed that if what's going on in your head is a bunch of chemical reactions, that there are no choices involved. Everything is predetermined. He also would be considered a rational dissenter. He did believe that you could learn about God from the Bible, so he didn't reject the Bible. But he also believed in learning about God from, or learning about the God from observing the natural world. He did not believe in vicarious atonement. He thought Jesus was only a human. But he also thought that Jesus could be a role model for morality. And he was, interestingly enough, he was awaiting the second coming. I'm not sure who was going to come, but he was awaiting the second coming. The next person of interest to us is Jose Ballou, who was a Universalist. He wrote his treatise on atonement in 1805, and he was considered an ultra-universalist. He rejected legalism and he rejected Trinitarianism, as unbiblical. So he was also a Unitarian as well as a Universalist, but the term Unitarian Universalism didn't exist then. He's known for being a Universalist. He rejected the God of Calvinism, the angry God. He believed that Jesus' death released a spirit of love. He believed in universal salvation, but he also accepted the truth of the Bible. Now, among Universalists at that time, there were sort of two Universalist beliefs. There was the more legalistic belief where people who did terrible things during their life should suffer somewhere along the line after they died. Now, the Catholics had purgatory for that, but the Reformers rejected purgatory. So there were people who believed that there had to be some kind of punishment. Ballou, on the other hand, I think believed that everybody was immediately saved, that there was universal salvation as soon as you died, and it didn't make any difference how bad you were while you were living. So anyway, the debate started. Was there universal salvation or was there Calvinism? Was God a loving God or an angry God? The Unitarian controversy boiled over in the early 1800s in New England. The congregational churches there were known as the Standing Order churches, or the New England Way churches. Now, some of these churches became more liberal in membership and theology in the 1700s. They became more inclusive. Within congregations, there was a lot of bitterness. There were the liberals and there were the conservatives. Up until this time, there had been pulpit exchanges among the different congregations. That stopped by the early 1800s. There were so many internal disputes that some churches actually split. Okay, into this mix, Harvard Divinity School stopped being a Calvinist theological school and became non-denominational in 1805. This was significant. The Hollis Chair of Divinity was passed to a Unitarian. And this became part of the controversy between the Unitarians and the Orthodox Calvinists. The liberal theologian became the head of the Divinity School. This was Henry Ware, 1805. Dissenting faculty who were still Calvinistic left, and they formed the Andover Theological Seminary 3 years later because they felt that they had no place at Harvard anymore, that Harvard was too liberal. Andover became the headquarters for the United Church of Christ and the Baptist churches. An example of one of the worst breakups of a church during the Unitarian controversy was the church in Dedham, Massachusetts. This was the most publicized at the time. Dedham was here just south of Boston, and this was the first church. This was the first legal challenge to the idea of the standing order system. And here it became the will of the parish versus the will of the church members. The conservatives left. They formed a church on the other side of the square, and they took with them the church silver and also their records. So this led to a civil trial. And the liberals won, and the conservatives were forced to return whatever they had removed to the minority, who were the liberals, but who were part of the original, who consider themselves to be part of the original church. I can't tell you which side was which, actually, but
Since the parish is made up of people.
the parish is made up of people, but the church, for whatever reason, the dissenters became in this case, were not the liberals. The dissenters were the conservative ones. They left in a huff and went across the town square and formed their own church. Now, I would think that I don't know which side was which, but all I know is it did wind up in a civil trial, and the original church building got its silver back, and those were the liberals who were staying there. The conservatives formed the new physical church. So to answer your question, I don't know. I don't know which one was which. I think the parish was the original church building, and I think they voted, and I think that's how it happened. Okay, into this mix is William Ellery Channing, one of the first Unitarians that we were familiar with, who established this idea of Unitarian Christianity in 1819. Now, his theology was that he considered God to be a loving parent, which is interesting. He did not accept the Trinity because he was a Unitarian. He believed that God created the universe and natural laws, but he also believed that God could suspend the natural laws, and therefore he considered miracles to be real things. He accepted the Bible as true. He accepted that the New Testament was more important than the Old Testament, but he also felt that the Bible was often misunderstood. He believed that Jesus was created, but not part of God. He believed that God acted through Jesus as the Christ. He accepted the idea that the resurrection actually happened, but he didn't know what the significance was. And he, like previous people, felt that Jesus was a role model. He thought people should strive to be Christ-like. And he believed that if you felt an allegiance to Jesus, you'd get closer to God. He also did not like the idea of creeds. He felt these separated Christians from Christ. He formed the American Unitarian Association in 1825, and this was their newspaper, the Christian Register and Boston Observer. And the interesting thing about this to me is that they were very much Christian. They were not talking about themselves as being atheists or agnostics. At this time, we're talking early 1825 here, Unitarians and Universalists both wanted to be true to the Bible. Okay, into this is a little bit of local history. Edmund Sears graduated from Harvard in 1837. He became a Unitarian minister, and either he wanted to become a missionary or he was told he should do some missionary work in the West. So he traveled presumably by early railroad and then by canal boat and then by steamboat to a little town that was frog and mosquito infested in northwest Ohio. This is, let's see, what street is which here? This is Monroe Street. This is Summit Street. Anyway, his missionary work didn't go all that well. He did meet, at least, he met the town fathers that he considered the founders of Toledo, and one of the town fathers in Toledo considered himself to be a heathen. He said he wanted more schools and less churches. I don't know who that was. I do know something about Toledo history, and I don't know who considered himself to be a pagan. Anyway, Sears went back to from where he came, namely Massachusetts, and eventually wrote the lyrics to this Christmas carol. Okay, the science or the scholarly field of biblical criticism is what I'm going to talk about next year. And this began with Spinoza, which I had mentioned earlier. He demonstrated that Moses could not have written the 5 books of Moses. He also thought the Old Testament prophets had good imaginations because they all felt that God was talking to them at night in dreams. So he said they were dreaming. I mean, Spinoza said that they weren't seeing God, they were seeing their own dreams. A new branch of this scholarship was being started as part of the German Enlightenment, where the New Testament was being looked upon in a way that had not been before. 2 ways of looking at the Bible were identified. The traditional church way of looking at the Bible was to assume that anything that's written in there was inspired by God, and therefore anything you're going to learn from it is just by reading the words without any attempt at critical thinking. The approach that was started by these German scholars, and to some extent by Spinoza before him, was what became known as the historical critical approach, where you look at the words, but you look at what the underlying historical situation was that led to the writings. For many traditional Christians, it didn't make any difference who wrote it or when it was written. It's all from God, and that's all you need to know. These talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s, scholars were saying, maybe we ought to take a look-see at what was going on when these particular stories were written so we can get a better idea of what was happening. The first person that we know of who really got into this was a German scholar, Hermann Reimarus, who published his first book, I think, in the late 1600s. But I think or it was even later than that, but I think he waited until after his death before it was made public because it was such a hot potato. Anyway, he was a well-known German philosopher during his lifetime, and he recognized that there was a distinction between what Jesus taught and what was portrayed about Jesus in the Gospels, and he considered Jesus to be a failed Messiah. That was pretty revolutionary. And he also thought that the disciples invented the resurrection. Okay, into this mix was David Strauss, who published a book called Das Leben Jehu in 1832, The Life of Jesus, which was a criticism of another work that had been written in German. This was translated into English in 1846, and I think it was part of his book that led to this, what became known as the two-source hypothesis for the Gospels. And then this hypothesis, Mark's Gospel became the source material for Matthew and Luke. About half of Matthew is taken directly from Mark. About a third of Luke's Gospel is taken from Mark. In addition, it was identified that there was another written source, apparently that's been lost now, that became known as the Q source, not having to do with QAnon, that's nothing to do with the Q from the German word Quelle, which means source in German, that provided just sayings of Jesus that appear in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. They're separate from the Markan material. And there are no miracles in any of this Q stuff. It's just sayings of Jesus. But they're in the same order in Matthew as in Luke, implying that there had to be a written source that Matthew and Luke drew from. This two-source hypothesis eventually was transmogrified into a four-source hypothesis, but I'm not going to go into that here. So anyway, during this time, the Universalists still wanted to be true to the Bible. We're talking early 1800s here. However, some Unitarians had been reading this scholarship coming out of Germany, and they started questioning whether the Bible itself was true. And this is really heretical. Okay, next person I'll talk about is Ralph Emerson. He was a Unitarian minister. He gave the Harvard Divinity School address in 1838, which was not well received by the faculty and by the American Unitarian Association. People called him an atheist, which he was not. His theology was that there was one God. And like the Quakers, he said you should look within to find that God. And his quote was, "Jesus Christ will be better loved by being less adored." He believed that judgment is in this life but not the next one. He loved nature, called the Concord Woods a cathedral, and he did not believe in biblical miracles. And I'm going to stop here since I think people have had enough, and so has my voice. And we'll start with Darwin next time. You know, speaking of Presbyterians, the only modern churches I think that still find their heritage directly from Calvinism is the Presbyterian Church. This was started in Scotland by a guy named John Knox in 1600s. I didn't include him because it's sort of not part of our story, but they adhered for a long time to Calvinist theology. But I think even they've softened up because their members were leaving. Nobody could tolerate that. Well, yeah, especially the Unitarian Universalists. The majority of members here were not born in this church. They were not born with this religious beliefs. We're refugees. That's how we are. And so our theology necessarily has to be inclusive, or most of us are going to get up and go out the door. Okay. I'll stop preaching. Thank you.
Thank you.